In May 1973, two children were walking across a bridge, following a horrifying siren sound. The siren stopped abruptly. It was as if someone had flicked a switch and turned the sound off. And this was the moment that everything changed. One of the children noticed something that absolutely chilled her to her core. She held out her arm, extended a finger, and pointed straight out in front of her. And that is when her friend saw it too. A three-fingered hand gripping the bridge from underneath. This story isn't just another UFO sighting or a ghost story or some kind of abduction. It's all of those things. And yet somehow at the same time, it's none of those things. This story is downright weird. It's the kind of story that leaves you staring at the ceiling at 2 AM thinking, what the fuck did I just hear? Let's get straight into it and, well, you'll see for yourself. This is the curious case of Sam the Sandown Clown. On a cool, damp evening of March 1972, on Compton Bay on the Isle of Wight, a man found himself alone, wandering the edge of the wet, glistening sand, just breathing it all in. His breath caught in his throat as a small ice-cold wave tickled his ankle. Seconds later, another splash climbed his leg, then another a little higher, a little stronger, a little colder. And within the space of a few minutes, this man's peaceful evening stroll was disturbed by panic. He didn't know what it was, but something wasn't right. Unsettled, the man looked out across the water, and that's when his gut instinct kicked in. Run. Because now, the water wasn't just trickling towards him, it was charging. It seemed like something had flicked a switch under the waves and decided the game was up. It had now become a race against time. A sudden surge, powerful, fast and unnatural, like some kind of miniature tsunami. So the man did what any other sane person would do under the circumstances. He turned and bolted as fast as he possibly could back towards his car. The problem was, by now, the water was knee-deep and rising, and that's when he heard the sound. A deep, mechanical whirring noise, like a low pulsing hum, somewhere out to sea. It sounded kinda like a warning siren, but not quite. It was slower, almost like it was droning through the water. By this point, he was wading through the water, fighting the tide. And that's when it suddenly occurred to the man. If he didn't make it to higher ground now, he wasn't going to make it back at all. He needed to make a decision, and he needed to make it now. To his left was a jagged line of rocks just poking up out of the water. He swam for his life, frantically and desperately. The man was completely alone and isolated. There were no lifeguards, no beachgoers or swimmers. It was just him, the sea, and that horrible droning sound. He reached the rocks, clambering up, terrified, exhausted, and shaking with adrenaline. He slipped more than once on the rocks, which were coated in slippery, slimy algae, before finally collapsing at the top, coughing, gasping, and soaked to the bone, but thankfully still alive. From the top of the rocks, he looked back towards the sea, which at this point was crashing furiously into the rocks below, and that's when it occurred to him. If he tried to make it to the beach, well, let's just say we wouldn't be telling this story now. He sat there stunned, trying to piece together exactly what had just happened. And then, just when he thought it was over, the sound returned. That droning hum, vibrating through the water like some great monstrous machine, was lurking beneath the waves. And if he thought the sound was terrifying, then boy, was he in for a nasty surprise. Piercing through the black water only 40 feet from where he sat, two bright yellow lights. Later, he would describe them as eyes, peering up at him like the eyes of some horrible sea monster. The distance between the eyes told the man that whatever this thing was, it was huge. Then, as quickly as they come, they sank, retreating, vanishing into the deep, black sea. The dreadful hum faded away, leaving nothing but the sound of waves crashing against the rocks. And then, the tide began to ease, leaving nothing but silence. What was that, Zog? You want the viewer to like and subscribe? A year later, in early May of 1973, in a peaceful little area called Lake Common, not far from Sandown Airport in the Isle of Wight, on a patch of marshland surrounded by golf courses, two children reported a very peculiar encounter that, honestly, sounds like a fairy tale written during an acid trip. Both children were around 7 years old. A girl named Fay and a boy whose name has never been made public were playing near the edge of this common. It was nothing more than your average holiday playdate. It was quite warm and sunny for early May, but other than that, nothing out of the ordinary. The children played in the grass, ate ice cream and searched for bugs and other small creatures. It was around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun was high in the sky and the children were enjoying a game of hide and seek. That was until they heard that sound echoing across the landscape. Both kids stopped dead in their tracks and listened. This was definitely not a sound that was familiar to the children. It wasn't an animal, and it most certainly wasn't the wind. In fact, it didn't sound natural at all. It sounded like a siren, shrill and warbling, almost like an air raid siren, but not quite. And this is where most kids would think, that's not a sound I've ever heard before, and it certainly doesn't sound friendly. Better leave it alone. Maybe even go and tell an adult. But Fay and her friend, against their better judgment, they decided to investigate. They followed the sound across a golf course and climbed through a hedge into a swampy field that backs onto Sandown Airport. The further they wandered, the louder and more intense the sound grew. It was constant, and at this point, kind of hard to bear. But what made the whole situation even stranger was that no one else seemed to be reacting to the sound at all. People on the golf course carried on playing, completely unfazed. Airport workers went about their jobs, seemingly unaware. Not one of them even flinched. It was almost like the sound was specifically intended for the children, and nobody else. Now, just off in the distance, they spotted a small wooden footbridge crossing a narrow brook. The children started walking across the bridge, following that sound. And that is when everything changed. The siren stopped abruptly, like someone had flicked a switch and turned the sound off. And that is when Fay noticed something that absolutely chilled her to her core. She held her arm out and extended a finger, pointing straight out in front of her. And that's when her friend saw it too. A hand gripping the bridge from underneath. So, we've got two kids on their own, which, let's be honest, that's a bit suspect already. Then we've got a creepy, droning siren sound that only they can hear. And now, a random hand poking up from under the bridge. Not that it's ever normal to see a hand reaching up from underneath a bridge, but something about this hand was especially strange. For starters, this hand only had 3 fingers. And what's more, it was wearing a blue glove. The two children froze on the spot the second they saw the hand, both perplexed and bewildered, because this whole situation was anything but ordinary. And then came the rest of him. Out from the shadows crawled a figure. He was tall, slender and stiff, almost freakishly thin, with arms and legs that stretched just a little too far to be natural. It looked like a man. Sort of. If you squinted and took hallucinogenics first. He was freakishly tall, nearly 7 feet according to Fay. And if this man didn't already look bizarre enough, he didn't appear to have a neck. Just a head plonked directly onto his shoulders, like a life-sized Lego man. And he was holding some kind of book, which he accidentally dropped into the water. And then he just kind of stood there, awkwardly splashing around, trying to fish the book out of the water. Now, the children were watching all of this unfold, completely gobsmacked. It very much seemed like he had no idea how his arms worked, or his fingers, or basic physics for that matter. And what's more, this guy's clothes were ripped and torn, but bright, like a psychedelic clown had gone 12 rounds with a combine harvester. Let me give you the full mental picture. Brace yourselves because it's fucking weird. He was dressed in this bright green tunic with a bold red collar that made him look like some kind of deranged court jester. On his head, a tall yellow pointed hat, the kind you'd expect to see in a child's drawing of a wizard, except this one was topped with a little black ball, just for good measure. Sticking out from the sides of his head were two wooden antennae, like twigs poking out of the head of a snowman. His skin was paper white, almost like it had been painted on, with triangular eyes, a square brown nose, and yellow lips that didn't move, not even when he spoke. A fringe of red hair protruded from underneath his hat and hung limp across his forehead. And his arms? His actual sleeves looked like they were made of wooden slats, sticking out stiffly like puppet arms, just to add to his already bizarre appearance. Oh, and if you're wondering what kind of footwear he had on, he didn't. He didn't have any socks or footwear on at all, exposing all three of his toes on each foot. Which is of course completely normal. I mean, what kind of tall, skinny, strange-looking man in clown attire wouldn't only have 3 toes? Makes perfect sense if you ask me. So at this point, Fay and the boy are crouched in the bushes, scared but curious. Like, what the hell are we even looking at? The clown eventually gives up on his soggy book and starts to retreat. Now, when I say retreat, you're probably imagining this guy, this clown thing, whatever he is, walking or maybe even jogging away. But that's not how this story goes. As I said, nothing about this story is normal. The man started hopping, yes, hopping, off towards a nearby metallic hut of all things. Again, nothing suspect about this behaviour whatsoever. The hut had no windows. It was just a weird bunker-like structure tucked away in the marsh like it had been dropped there from orbit. The man disappeared inside the hut, entering through a flap. Fay and her friend reacted in a way that most children of their age probably would do in such a situation. They turned and they ran. Or at least, they started to. Are you falling asleep? Because they only made it about 50 feet when they were stopped in their tracks by the sound of that awful siren again. That horrible wailing sound. And now it was even closer and louder than it was before. They stopped dead still and slowly turned on the spot to face the direction they had just ran from. And there he was, eerily standing right outside the hut, just watching them. Only this time, he was holding something else in his hand. It looked like some kind of microphone-looking device with a white wire dangling from it. And here's where things went from weird to now we are seriously losing the plot. Because when he finally spoke to the children, they didn't hear it audibly, through their ears, as you might expect. They heard it inside their heads, as if the man was communicating telepathically. He said,
"Hello, are you still there?"
Which seemed like a bizarre question to ask, as he could clearly see the children. I mean, they were standing right in front of him in plain sight. Something about the man seemed captivating, inviting even, not malicious or threatening in the slightest. So, slowly and cautiously, the 2 children approached the man, who was standing outside his metal hut, still in those torn up, strangely colourful clothes, still with that paper white face, with the random markings, and still not blinking. He didn't speak at all this time. Well, not vocally anyway. Instead, he pulled out a notebook and a pencil. With the pencil clutched awkwardly between his 3 fingers, he began to scribble a bunch of random words all over the page, completely out of order. In fact, what he was writing simply made no sense to the children at all. They looked at each other with a kind of, "What on earth is he doing?" look on their faces. That was until he started pointing to each word in turn, like he was attempting to teach the children how to read some kind of alien poetry. Suddenly, the words made sense. Kind of. Fay, bless her, driven by curiosity, played along and read the words out loud. "Hello, and I am all colours Sam." From that moment on, this bizarre figure would be forever known as Sam the Sandown Clown. Now, if things weren't already insane enough, we're about to leap face first into the Twilight Zone because, once again, Sam started to speak, without the microphone this time. Sam spoke, but his lips didn't move. They didn't even twitch, and his voice sounded muffled. It was almost as if some kind of recording was being played from inside his head. Crazy, right? Yet, as terrifying as this may sound, to the children, Sam seemed friendly. His demeanour wasn't threatening or intimidating at all. He just seemed curious more than anything. He initiated conversation by asking the kids about themselves and encouraged them to ask him questions in return. You are falling asleep, aren't you? Kids being kids, the first question they asked was regarding his clothes. Sam responded by saying that these were the only set of clothes he owns, which is why they're all torn. The next question the children asked was, "Are you a man?" To which Sam simply laughed and said,
No.
"Then are you some kind of ghost?"
Well, not really. But I am, in an odd sort of way.
Sam responded. The children then pressed further, asking Sam, "So, what are you then?" To which Sam gave the most cryptic answer of all.
You know what I am.
No, Sam, we don't know. That's the problem. Give us a fucking clue. That's not what the children said, that's me thinking out loud. Now here's where it gets really unsettling. During this whole surreal interaction, there were two workmen fixing a fence nearby, just carrying on with their work as normal. They didn't look up, they didn't react, they didn't acknowledge any of what was happening right in front of them. I mean, surely, in this day and age, if two workmen had noticed two very young children hanging around some strange-looking metal hut with a very suspect-looking man in a clown costume, they'd intervene in some way, shape or form. Well, I'd certainly like to think so. But Fay would later say, it seemed like the workmen couldn't see her at all, or her friend, and definitely not Sam. Whatever was going on, it wasn't just weird. It seemed to be selectively real. Then Sam did the unthinkable and invited the children inside the hut. And the kids, possibly under some kind of influence or just riding the wave of pure childhood curiosity, agree and enter. There was no front door. Instead, the children had to crawl through that flap on the side of the hut, like some kind of makeshift cat flap. And inside the hut is where things get even weirder, if that's at all possible. Remember, everything we know about Sam and his bizarre abode comes from the mouths and minds of two children. As they recall it, the hut was split into two levels. The bottom level had just enough headroom for Sam to stand upright. There was blue and green wallpaper with strange dial patterns printed all over it. The furniture was wooden and rough. It looked almost makeshift. And there was also a small electric heater positioned neatly in the corner of the hut. It sounds a lot like someone had tried to decorate a UFO using only leftover bits from a second-hand garden shed. And upstairs wasn't much better either. It was metallic, cold and unwelcoming. At some point during this wild interaction, Sam decided to remove his pointy hat and revealed round white ears and a patchy head of reddish-brown hair. Now, if your brain is as weird as mine, you might have been thinking, well, if Sam doesn't move his mouth to talk, then how does he eat? Well, my friends, wonder no more, because next, for some bizarre reason, Sam decided to show the children exactly how he eats. Sam picks up a berry, and instead of eating it like you, or me, or, a normal creature, he placed it in his ear. I kid you not, he placed it in his fucking ear. Then he thrusted his head forward, and the berry disappeared. And just seconds later, that very same berry reappeared in Sam's eye of all places. Then, without saying a single word, he jerked forward again, and the berry dropped into his mouth, which, again, didn't move. He just kind of hoovered it down, consumed it like air. And that's it. That's how Sam snacks. If this wasn't some interdimensional being, then it was a deeply committed mime artist with a berry fetish. Either way, it was disturbing. The children remained inside Sam's hut for approximately half an hour, talking and answering and asking questions. Precisely what they talked about during that time is mostly unknown. Fay only remembers bits and pieces. Eventually, they said their goodbyes. The children crawled back through the flap, and they ran back across to the golf course. The marsh was empty, and the eerie sound of that siren had completely disappeared. As they ran, Fay recalled periodically glancing back at Sam's hut, half expecting him to be following behind. But, much to Fay's surprise, he hadn't followed at all. It was almost as if Sam's work had been done. However, as the children moved away from Sam's hut, it was almost as if the reality of what had just happened hit them, and they were suddenly overcome with a feeling of dread and fear. They ran as fast as they possibly could until they came across two men, who they recounted the events to, almost expecting the man to help in some way. But the men didn't help at all. They laughed and mocked the children, slamming them for making up stories and telling lies. So, the children carried on their way and headed off home. Because, let's be honest, who in their right mind would believe this? Would you believe it? Now, you might think that's the end of the story. Just a couple of kids, a creepy clown thing in a tin shack, and a bizarre afternoon in the marsh. But no, absolutely not. That was only the beginning. Because it just so happens Fay wasn't the only member of her family who had experienced strange things. And that brings us to Fay's dad, known only as Mr. Y. Let's go back 3 years before Fay's encounter with Sam. On October 20th, 1970, Mr. Y was driving alone at night to a friend's house. He was travelling down a quiet country road in the village of Brading on the Isle of Wight. No music, no traffic. It was just the quiet hum of his engine revving along as he reflected to himself on the day's events. But, as he travelled further down the road, he began to feel this nagging sensation that something wasn't quite as it seemed. He couldn't put his finger on it exactly, but something felt wrong. Ominous almost. As he turned onto the stretch of road near the River Yar, something caught his eye in his rearview mirror. Lights. But we're not talking about headlights here. We're talking 7 glowing red lights, not at ground level, no. These lights were hovering in the sky. They were spherical, like blood-red balls of energy floating in the sky and spaced in a perfect ring around a central fuselage. This was not a plane, nor was it a helicopter. This thing was silent, massive, and undoubtedly not of this world. So intrigued was Mr. Y that he pulled over at the side of the road and got out of his car to get a better look. As he stood there at the side of the road staring at this strange object in the sky, it became unnervingly apparent that it was watching him too. And this is where Mr. Y's encounter goes from unnerving to terrifying. He got back into his car and continued onwards down the country lane, periodically checking his rearview mirror. It became apparent to Mr. Y that this alien craft was following him. No, it was stalking him. When he sped up, so did the craft. When he slowed down, the craft slowed down too. When he turned, the craft followed. And then without warning, it cut across the road behind him, maybe 300 feet back, and just glided over the treetops like it was pacing a hunt. Now if that was me, I'd be in full-blown panic mode. I would have been foot to the floor until I reached the nearest town. But this wasn't me. This was Mr. Y. And what did he do? He grabbed a torch, he stopped the car once more, walking into a field, and shined his torch straight at the craft. And once again, it stared straight back at him. It didn't move, it just watched, almost like 7 red eyes, unblinking, staring straight into his soul, observing his every movement. Eventually, Mr. Y got back into his car and drove full speed to his friend's house. When he arrived, he began explaining exactly what he'd seen to his friend, not really knowing how his friend would react. I mean, this story is pretty far-fetched, right? As he's relaying the encounter, his friend, driven by curiosity, suggested that they both step outside and take a look. Now, if you're a horror movie buff like me, you'll know exactly how this plays out. Main character has terrifying encounter, tells a friend what's happened, they investigate together, there's nothing to be seen. But that's not what happened here. Sure enough, not too far off in the distance, just as described, there were the lights, in plain sight for both men to see. There was no doubting it, they were there. Only now they seemed to be toying with the men, exhibiting some kind of strange behaviour, dancing back and forth, periodically disappearing into the tree lines before seemingly peeking back out. But for Mr. Y, this was far from an isolated incident. Over the next 2 years, similar encounters occurred time and time again. Sometimes when he was driving, other times when he was out on evening walks. Sometimes there would be a singular red light, other times there would be multiple. But the thing that always remained consistent was their behaviour. They always seemed to be observing quietly from a distance. Initially, Mr. Y was scared of these lights, intimidated by their presence. And let's be honest, who could blame him? He didn't know what they were, what their intentions were, and vitally, what they were capable of. But eventually, he just kind of became accustomed to their presence. They didn't seem to wish him any harm, they were just there. That was until that evening of March 1972 on Compton Bay, because of course, the man who had seen those lights, those eyes staring back at him from under the deep black waves, like some kind of subterranean sea monster, was Mr. Y, Fay's father. But just to add an extra layer of curiosity to the whole story, he never told Fay. He never breathed a word of these encounters to his daughter. And yet, 3 years later, she comes home, pale-faced and trembling. Initially, much like Mr. Y had kept his own experience to himself, Fay also didn't talk about her encounter with Sam and his hut. But as days went by, Fay's dad noticed that she was a bit more quiet than usual. It was clear that something was troubling her. Every time he asked her what was wrong, she'd just shrug it off or change the subject. You know how kids can be. But then, one day, for reasons even she probably couldn't explain, she told him. She sat down, took a breath, and started talking. And what came out wasn't some half-baked fairy tale or childish dream. It was a very detailed account of something far stranger. Something she hadn't told anyone. Not really, since the first time she and her friend were laughed off by those two men. At first, her dad laughed too, told her to stop being silly, but that only made it worse. You could see it on her face, that sinking look of disappointment when another grown-up doesn't believe you. That sting of embarrassment, and maybe something deeper, fear. But the more she spoke, the harder it became to dismiss. There was something about the way she described it all. The tone, the pacing, the bizarre little details that couldn't possibly have been conjured in the mind of a 7-year-old girl. And beneath all that, there's something else. Something in her eyes. She wasn't just spinning a tale, he could see it, and he could feel it. She was troubled, deeply. Now, while Mr. Y did believe that there was some truth in Fay's story, he wasn't entirely convinced that some of it hadn't been slightly exaggerated or lost in translation. Whatever had happened, it was real enough to rattle his daughter, and that was more than enough to send him looking for answers. So his first stop? The boy that Fay had been playing with that day. Now, this kid, he was a different case. Quieter, less willing to talk. He wasn't exactly bursting to share his version of events, but when he did, he said just enough to turn Mr. Y's stomach. Because yes, he absolutely remembered that day. He remembered the field, and he definitely remembered Sam. And most of what he said, it lined up perfectly with Fay's version of events. That was the moment Mr. Y knew something wasn't right. So his next stop was the brook where they said it all happened. Mr. Y searched the place himself, hoping to find something, anything, but there was no sign of a metallic hut, and certainly no sign of a 7-foot-tall, 3-fingered clown. Just a quiet patch of marshland, like nothing had ever even been there at all. But still, the story clung to him. So he did what any half-rational, half-desperate man would do. He asked Fay to describe what had happened again, and again, and again. He wrote it all down, every detail, every word. He even reached out to a UFO investigator at Bufora, the British UFO Research Association, and handed the whole thing over. Not for fame, not for money. He didn't even give his name. He just wanted someone, anyone, to take it seriously, to tell him he wasn't losing his mind, that he hadn't failed to protect his daughter from whatever this thing was. He wasn't asking for headlines. He was just asking to be heard, and potentially to be given some answers. Now, by this point, Mr. Y had been around the block a few times when it came to strange lights in the sky, so he'd already developed a deep curiosity, maybe more like an obsession with UFO cases. And it was that lens, that years-long simmering paranoia, that shaped how he interpreted what had happened to his daughter. To him, this wasn't just a ghost story. It wasn't just some weirdo in a mask. Whoa, not everyone in a mask is a weirdo. It was all way too familiar. There were details in Fay's account that lined up far too closely with other abduction reports he'd come across over the years. Especially one particular part that he just couldn't shake. The two workmen. Now, these men were nearby, close enough to see the children, and definitely close enough to see the 7-foot clown creature loitering in broad daylight beside his metal hut in the middle of a bog. And yet, they didn't even glance up. They didn't react at all, like nothing was happening, like none of it was even there. Mr. Y later said, and I quote, "I get the impression that Fay was somehow taken into a bubble of alien reality, created by this strange personage. Because Fay swore up and down that those two men were right there, fixing a post, while she and her friend were deep in conversation with this bizarre figure with a painted face and a metal hut. But those two workers were seemingly oblivious to the whole scene. That's what disturbed Mr. Y the most. The sense that this wasn't just something Fay saw, it was something she was pulled into, a kind of separate reality, a pocket world, an overlay. Because here's the thing, at no point did Fay or her friends say they thought Sam was an alien, not once. They said he was a ghost, or maybe a man, or maybe something in between. Something that was there, but not really. And honestly, that might be the most terrifying possibility of all. So, what the hell do we make of all of this? The Sandown Clown story is often tossed around in paranormal circles as one of the weirdest UFO encounters of all time. And honestly, personally, I think without more evidence, that feels like a bit of a stretch. Because while there are definitely echoes of abduction lore, Sam never actually beams anyone up into a spaceship, does he? Instead, we get this strange, fragmented fairy tale, so to speak. At first glance, I'll admit, I dismissed it. It sounded like the kind of tall tale a couple of imaginative kids might spin after watching one too many weird TV shows and eating too many E-numbers. If you've ever been forced to watch Blippi, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But then you factor in the dad's involvement, Mr. Y, and suddenly it all feels a lot murkier. Because now we have an adult who's been seeing strange lights in the sky for years, suddenly confronted with his daughter telling him, completely unprompted, that she met a strange being in the marsh. Did Mr. Y simply project his own obsessions onto his daughter's weird memory? Possible. Maybe he just wanted there to be a connection. Maybe there really was a connection between Sam and the lights that Mr. White had been seeing all along. Remember, Fay never concluded that Sam was some kind of extraterrestrial being. She never said he was an alien, and neither did her friend. They thought he was a ghost, or a man, or something in between. They described him like a marionette, a puppet made of slats and knobs and paint, wearing tattered clothes and hopping around like his knees didn't even work properly. And it's that blend of the organic and the artificial that's what I find most intriguing. A hut made of metal, but decorated inside with flowery wallpaper and wooden chairs. Ragged clown clothes, but a strange device that lets him broadcast his voice into your head. Wooden antennae. Berry tricks. It's all just too weird to be made up, and yet, if someone told you they'd seen this thing today, you'd probably call the police, or the men in white coats. But here's where it gets darker, because let's just say for argument's sake that Sam wasn't a ghost or an alien. Let's say he was a man. A real person, someone in costume. Then suddenly, this goes from spooky to sinister really fast. You've got a tall man hiding in the bushes near a golf course, wearing a bizarre homemade outfit with painted on features, 3 fingers, a microphone, and he's luring children into a shack in the woods. That is a crime scene waiting to happen. Some people have floated the idea that Sam might have been a travelling entertainer, a children's magician who fell on hard times. Maybe the berry trick was his signature move at a birthday party before he went feral. And I'll get it, that's technically the rational explanation, but again, why was he so cryptic? When the kids asked what he was, he didn't say, "I'm just a guy," or "I work for the circus." When asked if he was a ghost, he said, "Well, not really, but I am in an odd sort of way." Then he followed that up with the most evasive response of all. "You know what I am." "Sorry, no, we don't, Sam. We don't know anything, and maybe that's the point." There's this eerie possibility that Sam wasn't disguising himself as a clown because he was a clown, but more because that's what he thought the children would trust. Does that make sense? I'm not sure if I've explained myself very well there, but even if that was true, that's pretty disturbing in itself. Like something pretending to be familiar, but getting all the details wrong, like a badly drawn picture. I don't think there was the same anti-clown hysteria back in the 70s like there is now. So maybe Sam figured, I'll be bright, I'll be colourful, I'll juggle berries and children will love me. Again, that's fucking creepy and fucking weird. And what's more, when Mr. Y investigated the marshland, he found no evidence of the metal hut. Maybe he was searching in the wrong place. Or maybe the hut wasn't a hut at all. Maybe it was a caravan or an RV that he drove away in. I don't know, I'm just clutching at straws and trying to draw my own conclusions. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a part of me that believes in this sort of thing. The supernatural elements, I mean. Or why would I find these stories so intriguing? In the end, maybe Sam was just trying to pass through, trying to be something we could understand. But whatever he really was, it was hiding behind the paints, behind the fringe, behind those wooden antennae and that unsettling mouth that doesn't move. And maybe it still is. Maybe the truth is, we'll never really know what happened that day on the Isle of Wight. All we have are the recollections of the 2 children. An encounter that plagued their minds. And who knows, maybe, just maybe, we haven't seen the last of All Colours Sam. I really hope you enjoyed this episode on Sam the Sandown Clown. I'd love to hear your theories in the comment section. What do you think Sam was? An alien? A ghost? A man? Or something else entirely? Until next time, thanks for watching. I'm your host, Severed Soul.